in, but I figured maybe if someone else presses it.
Okay. Now we've gone live.
Nice. Hi,
Oh
everyone.
man, and
Sorry to
everybody
join.
missed the beautiful music.
Yeah, darn. Well, hello to everyone waiting. Yeah, we forgot to hit the go live button, but we're reaching the end of the year, so we're we're getting there. But welcome to another live episode of Visual Studio Toolbox. I'm one of your hosts, Leslie Richardson.
And I'm your other host, Robert Green.
Cool. And welcome to the last live show of the year. And joining us to close things out for 2023 is Microsoft MVP Lance McCarthy. Hey, Lance.
Hello. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, thanks for being here. So, what are we talking about today?
So typically, you're a developer and you're proud of all the work you've done and you're ready to share it with the world. And then you hit another set of, problems and headaches, and that's called deployment. And I'm here to help today to show how you can automate some of that and keep that burden off your shoulders.
Great. Yeah, that's pretty
Fantastic.
important. No one wants the headache of shipping the thing that you're just so ready to share with everybody, right?
Yeah.
So,
And this is a great end to our episodes we did a couple of weeks ago or last week. It's all blurred. DevOps with GitHub Actions, DevOps with Azure Pipelines. We had Josh Johanning on that. Then we did an 18-part series on getting started building MAUI apps with XAML. And now we're doing DevOps for MAUI apps. So it's kind of a great way to end the year.
yeah, totally.
Yeah,
Great.
we'll be plugging all those pieces together, and if you've seen those, you will be familiar with some of the things that we're going to do today.
Awesome. Well, I'm looking forward to it. So, Lance, would you like to tell us a little bit more about yourself before we talk about
Sure.
deployment?
Yeah, my name's Lance McCarthy, as Leslie mentioned. I'm a Microsoft MVP under the Developer Technologies and Windows Development categories. Been an MVP for, I think, 11 years. Started back in the Windows Phone days. I caught the development bug writing Windows Phone apps and putting the first Windows Phone apps in the store. And it's been an incredible ride since. Sharing this knowledge with the people around me makes it worth it even more, and why I'm here today. And I'm from Boston. I might have lost a little bit of my Boston accent, but you might hear it slip through every now and then on some words. But
Still hear
yeah.
it. I used to live in Boston, so
Professionally, I
You're
work at
mine,
a
but I
company
don't
called
have a
Profit.
Boston accent.
Right. I hear people that say, "Hey, wait a second. The last time I talked to you, didn't you have a Boston accent? Where did that go?" Yeah, professionally during the day, I work for a company called Progress Software. Most of you might know who they are by either Kendo or Telerik, the UI controls. I'm the manager of the technical support team for the United States. Um, but I am still very hands-on with code, answering support tickets, solving problems, and it's basically I love doing it, and I can't imagine myself not doing it.
great.
Cool.
Well, thanks, Lance. So just to kickstart, can you share a little bit about what are some of the common frustrations or pitfalls people tend to experience when they're trying to deploy their applications?
I would say there are two categories. One is understanding the build settings because you're used to just using debug and everything is there and the apps are big and they don't get trimmed. Then all of a sudden now you're doing it in release and things break on you and you don't know why. Understanding a little bit of why assemblies get trimmed kind of, really gets you frustrated there. And once you get all the build stuff working and you finally are able to build it the way that you wanted to build it and it's working, now you have to deal with the gatekeepers of the store or e-commerce platform that you're trying to publish through. And there's typically a few different ways to go through that, do certification as a business or an individual. And then once you get past that part, then you need to know how to sign your code with the authentication that they give you. In the code world, we use certificates to sign our code. And in some places, there's a little bit of extra, something like an Apple provisioning profile that you have to also add that makes it more difficult. The two buckets are understanding the building side of things and then the publishing side of things.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that makes sense. Cool. So can we dive in and figure out how we can alleviate some of those problems?
Yeah. So today I'll be mostly just showing you the building side of things, but that also includes a little bit of getting there and a little bit of after it. So I thought the first place we could start is my screen showing it? No, there we go.
There it is.
First place we can start is the dotnet MAUI's deployment documentation. I know you might hear the word docs and be like, oh, it's a dry, static environment. The one thing I want to say about the MAUI docs is this is truly a living document where all the lessons that the MAUI team has learned through GitHub issues as people work with MAUI, or even just inherited from Xamarin Forms in some way, are now documented in this one place. You can drill down to any of the platforms that you're trying to go into and then get the specific details there. And much of the stuff I will show you today is in here. I've condensed some of the highlights into a little GitHub gist that I will share with you. This is just another page where I distill the most important key facts that you can read through this really quick and be like, okay, I get the high level of it. And you can also use this as a jumping back point when you want to understand, oh, I forgot how to write that little bit of YAML that builds the Windows app as an unpackaged app or something like that. But yeah, back to the beginning, this page is where you should start.
Great.
Mm-hmm.
Over here on the left, you'll see the subtopics. There are some details under here that you would go into, like project config and iOS specifics, but more importantly, expand the publish one. And then you'll see each platform, and under each platform are the details for that platform that you need to know before you even start writing any of your pipeline stuff. So this bookmark this page, and I've already got it in the gist that I shared with everyone. A little bit of the exact articles you can jump into. Okay, but today's article is about DevOps. I mean, this session is about DevOps, right? So how is this related to DevOps? Most devs have a choice, right? You're going to probably build the code in GitHub Actions, or you're going to do an Azure DevOps, and I'll show both today. I have a repository here. This is kind of a overall big, huge bucket of different DevOps workflows called GitHub Actions for many different project types. So don't get lost if you first click the source button and you see all these other different types of .NET stuff. It's because I wanted this information to be in a single place no matter what app you're developing. Today, since we're talking about MAUI, there's just a single MAUI project in here, very simple. It's got a main page and an app shell, and it basically just says hello world. Nothing special about it. Because the point of this repo is to show you how to use GitHub Actions. GitHub Actions, your workflows are always under the .github/workflows folder. You might have extra folders, and these workflows point to the other folders, but this is typically where you'll have your main workflow. And we have one workflow for .NET MAUI. So before I expand into this, let's take a step back and understand the structure of a .NET MAUI project. It is called the single project setup, where the CS Proj has a special way of understanding, and .NET and MS Build has a special way of understanding what platform you're targeting, called the TFM. If we actually take a quick look at the MAUI CS Proj, we're going to see something called target frameworks. And you can see we have 4 different ones here, where the project can be built for Android, it can be built for iOS, Mac Catalyst, or Windows 10. And thanks to the work that Microsoft and .NET team has put into building these types of projects, all you really have to do is tell .NET to build a specific CS project, and then you pass it the framework moniker, the TFM, which is this actual word here. So if we come back to the workflow, you notice I have 4 different jobs. Excuse me. There's a job called MAUI Android. Let's go down real quick. There's a job called MAUI Windows, MAUI iOS, and MAUI Mac Catalyst. And the way GitHub Actions works is you can have your workflow do more than one job in parallel or in subsequent manner. Since we don't need to wait for the iOS project to be done building to start the Android one, why don't we just build all 4 at the same time and just get it done really quick? That is the first major advantage of using CI to build your stuff. So you don't have to sit there in Visual Studio and build everything separately.
Mm-hmm.
Let's take a look at the anatomy of the Android job. So we're telling it, we want you to run on a Windows machine. We can build for Android on both Windows or Mac, but Windows is usually a little less expensive and usually more readily available. So I pick a Windows runner here, but just know that you could do this on both. The first thing we did is we just get the code. That command there just gets all the code from the repo. Very next thing we do is we install the .NET SDK. In this case, we're using .NET 8, and we just pick it. We tell it to pick the latest patch version. So you don't have to keep coming back in here and changing it to .03 or .04 or .05. Just put your wildcard there, and it'll pick the latest for you.
But you could specify that you want it to always use a specific version if you value that consistency, right?
Yep. Let's say, for example, you know there's an issue and, 04. All you have to do is just come back here and say, I want it to be 03.
Mm-hmm.
We're in read-only right now. Or you can use a limiter. You can use the brackets and the parentheses. I forget the term for it, the particular syntax, but it's what a lot of .NET uses for versioning, which will say go no larger than this or go up to this version. You can use that here as well.
Cool.
The next thing we need, now you got to think these runners are kind of like clean slates. You can't imagine that the runner has everything in the world installed. It does have a lot of stuff installed. And if you ever wanted to look up what's installed, you can just bing GitHub Windows Runner, and it'll show you everything that's already installed, such as Visual Studio 2022 and some other base SDKs. But it might not have some things you need. For example, the .NET and MAUI workloads, which we will do next. But here we make sure that Java is installed. I'm going to use version 11. This step here is just kind of a little tweak for me. Not everyone wants to do this or has to do it, but I like to have a version number of my app that's based on the date. So instead of version 1.0.x, have 2023.12.19, for example, which would tell me that release date.
That's kind of a neat thing to do, because then you know how old it is.
Yeah, it's a trade-off, right? Semantic version has its benefits because you know what a patch is versus a minor version versus a major version, which is useful for things like SDKs, because you want to know if there's a breaking change in the SDK. But if it's the end user's app, they're not consuming the app to build something else, so they're not worried about breaking changes. So this date-based versioning is better for them, in my opinion.
You could combine them though, right? You could do the 1.1.1.2023.10.12, right?
On some frameworks, gives you a hard time about the length of the version. Like on Windows, you can't have more than 4 digits per section.
Okay, got it.
It might work for others. I'm not sure.
Okay.
Yeah. You could cheat halfway, so I do have a way to do that with just month and date, because if you combine the month and the day, it'll never be more than 4 digits. That's kind of how I do that middle version number. So the first
Right.
is a year, the second is that. So what you can do is you can do 1.0.month day, and that
Okay.
would work. Yep. And it will always be sequential. So, some numbering schemes at a later version can actually be less in value and it would mess up your numbering.
Right.
Okay, now for some meat and potatoes here. The runner usually doesn't have a .NET workload installed. These are things on top of the .NET SDK, such as .NET Aspire, one of the new preview workloads. MAUI is a set of workloads. There's one word here, MAUI, that is a combination of all the various workloads. There's MAUI Android, MAUI iOS, MAUI Mac Catalyst, MAUI Windows. There's so many of them that you would have to remember if you're going to individually install them all. And since this is a runner, it kind of gets thrown away at the end. It's not a big deal if you install them all. This is kind of the easiest and troubleless way to do it. You just say .NET workload install MAUI, and it'll pull down everything you need up to the version that you're using.
Great. Also, would you be able to zoom in on the screen just a little bit? There you go.
How's that?
Awesome. Sweet.
Yeah.
Perfect.
So at this point, your runner has what it needs to start building your code. Right? So we have .NET 8 installed, and we have the MAUI workloads installed. Those are the kind of two bottom line things that you need, and then you can start specializing what you want to do next. In this case, I want to install my NuGet packages for the project. I have some third-party libraries in here, like Telerik UI for MAUI, so I can't really always depend on the .NET publish command to do it for me automatically. So I like to do it ahead of time, make sure that my package sources are authenticated, and that everything is there before I start building. And if it's only going to cost me a one-liner, I'm going to do it. That's peace of mind for me. You can use just .NET build and don't use the no restore flag, and it'll restore before it does the build. But this is just a step for peace of mind I recommend, particularly if you have more than one package source. And all I'm really doing is I'm saying restore that CS proj. Right now it's a variable, but if we go to the top, you can see that I'm saying the project path is here. And the NuGet path is here. If we come down to that command, we're seeing that it's actually using those variables. Now you might ask, why don't I just type that in here? It's because there are 3 other jobs in this workflow file. You could easily mistype something, and why do you have to keep typing the same thing over and over again? We can just put it in one variable and use that variable throughout the whole file. So in case something changes, you only need to just update the value of the variable that you set in the beginning of the workflow. Okay, the very last step here. And here's where I'll diverge between 2 different things. Right now, this is just a debug build. And I say just, it's kind of important to know this, because why would you only have a CI workflow for a release that has all the complicated things in it, such as your co-signing certificates and your publishing profiles and your trimming and all that stuff? You should actually do this first. So I highly recommend having your regular build that makes sure the code is good every time you pull a merge into main, and you want to make sure that your branch is building and you have confidence to move forward. So this particular workflow builds when the main branch is updated. It's not publishing to the store yet because we're only concerned about CI. So what I do is just build, debug, and here's the magic name. -F is the framework, your target framework. And if you notice, this is the same TFM moniker that we had inside the CS proj. There's 2 extra little things. And if you're not used to using command line for building, some of this stuff comes across as scary, right? Just noisy and scary. If you look at each individual command separately and isolate it from the rest of what you're seeing, it's easier to digest and understand this command is really a compilation of different things you want to happen. So this particular one saves us a lot of time because we don't need to run this command again. We already did it once. This basically skips the restore stage of the build.
Nice. So regarding commands all up, is all of that listed in the documentation you were talking about earlier? Okay, cool.
Absolutely. So if you go to the .NET build documentation, all of these flags are there. So let me pull that up real quick as a good reference. So here's the documentation for .NET build. And I'm glad you mentioned that because there is also .NET publish down here too. All of the things that you would do in the command line are documented here, but even more importantly, it has the arguments and parameters that you might use. This section here is what I kind of mean about it looking scary at first. You might not know what each one does, but if you break it apart, like, okay, -C, oh, that means configuration. It means either debug or release. F, oh, that means the framework. There's tons of other great stuff in here, no dependencies, don't do it incremental. Particularly when you're targeting Linux, this isn't really relevant for MAUI, but it's still good to know. If you're targeting Linux or containers, the OS is a flag that you would set to Linux-x64 or ARM64. Runtimes, self-contained is another thing. It's not relevant to .NET MAUI, but if you wanted to combine your .NET app into a self-contained runnable thing without needing to have a runtime underneath it, that's the flag you can use. Let me click the publish one, and then we'll go back to the website. Where was I? Right here. Yep. Some flags you might not see in the documentation, and these might be relevant to a particular framework. So -P are MS Build, usually MS Build flags. So for example, Windows, if we go down to the Windows one. So now that we've gone to this, I'm going to skip down a little bit, but they're the same exact steps. All right, set up .NET Core, but for Windows, we need MS Build. I create the version number again based on the date. I install .NET MAUI. I restore the NuGet packages. And then we build the Windows project. And the only difference really between these is this says that the framework is .NET 8 Android. This one says the framework is Windows 10. And this part of the number just means the version of Windows 10 that you're targeting. About the last part, publish trimmed is a feature of a release build. It means take out all the code that I'm not actually using. So let's say you have 100 methods in a library, and in your code, you only have 5. You're only referencing 5 of those methods. Why do we need to compile the other 95 and distribute that extra load with your application if it's never going to be used? Trimming basically says, it goes through the object tree and it says, okay, look for the references. What am I using and what am I not using? And it'll trim out those other parts that aren't being used so that your final executable or package is as small as possible. This has some downsides. It's a little out of scope of today's session to go into it. But for example, if you're using reflection in your project, the reflection basically guesses if something is there. It's not a hard reference to an object or a class. So the trimmer will go through and say, hey, color road red method is not being called. So I can take it out. But then later on down the road, your app is running and the user clicks the button color road red, and then you have some code that uses reflection to go and find that, it will fail because the trimmer took it out. There's some consideration when it comes to trimming. There's really good documentation about this in the MAUI publishing docs right here. because it's a very important topic for iOS. iOS has a pretty aggressive trimmer. And if you're using things like static libraries and static native iOS libraries, it might accidentally trim the whole thing out and your app will break in a release build. A little bit farther than what we can talk about today. I'm always available on Twitter if you feel like if you have a problem with your app being trimmed, you can always ping me. Microsoft Q&A is a great resource to help with this too. But just being aware of what trimming is saves you 90% of your headache.
That's cool that that option's even there. Yeah, I'm sure that's like a time saver.
It's usually by default, so it catches you off guard.
Oh, really?
Yeah, you're like, why is my app not working? And it's because the trimming is enabled in release because you want your app as small as possible. Yeah. All right. What about the iOS build? So far we've done two things. The workflow says it has a name. It has an action, right? So the action is either I can trigger it manually, or if there's a push to the main branch or the MAUI branch, and that push has any changes to these files or folders, that will trigger the jobs. I wish I could disable this selection thing. There we go. Then we set some variables and the jobs list. I didn't go into details about the workflow itself because it's, again, outside the scope of what we're talking about. But we have 4 jobs. So we looked at the Android one. Here's the Windows one. Now let's look at the iOS one. Now we're starting to see something different. Notice the type of machine that it's running on. Now we're choosing a Mac. This is because iOS and Mac Catalyst, which is a flavor of iOS. Mac Catalyst is actually iOS running on Mac OS. But they both require that you compile on the Mac, at least for the release build. So right now we're getting a Macintosh machine from GitHub to run our code on. This is no longer needed, but sometimes you might have a machine that doesn't have the right version of Xcode on it. You can actually change what version of Xcode that's on there. Again, you're starting to see a pattern here. We're installing .NET SDK. I'm creating a version number. We're installing the workloads. We're restoring NuGet packages. And finally, we build the iOS project. Everything looks the same, except, okay, here's the TFM. I know I've said TFM several times, but I didn't explain the acronym. TFM stands for Target Framework Moniker. That's what this thing is. So whenever you see a list of target frameworks, the name that's in there is called a TFM.
Cool. Great catch, by the way. So many acronyms around here.
Exactly, right? I've watched things and the acronyms are flying left and right and I get lost so quickly. Yeah. So this time we're seeing, okay, wait, publish trimmed is turned on. But there's this extra thing over here called mTouch link. This is specific to Xcode and Xamarin iOS and .NET for iOS, which is the evolution of Xamarin iOS. This tells the linker to only link out stuff from the SDK. There are 3 values for the linker when it comes to iOS. None, SDK only, or everything. Right, so we're going to only link out stuff from the SDK that we're not using, but don't link out my code. Don't break my code. Just take out all the other stuff from the iOS SDK that I'm not using. That's a great middle ground, and this is usually the fix to problems you're having with trimming. Finally, the Mac Catalyst job. This is 100% identical to iOS, except for the TFM.
What's Mac Catalyst referring to exactly?
It is a and I apologize ahead of time to the Mac purist if I say this incorrectly, but Mac Catalyst is an evolution of a framework of allowing iOS to run on Mac. So several years ago, Apple came up with this ability for you to take your iOS app and run it on the Macintosh to run it on Mac OS. I'm sorry, inside a special container that's like an iOS runtime. So normally when you build a Mac app, it's done with the Mac OS SDK. But Mac Catalyst is letting you use the iOS SDK and run your iOS app on a Mac.
Okay, cool. So that still exists then, I'm assuming?
Yep.
Cool.
Yep. And dotnet MAUI does support Mac OS, but a lot of the libraries that you might want, like you've already used for your mobile app, probably doesn't have a Mac OS flavor to it for many reasons. But so then you're like, well, everything I need is already in my iOS app, and I want that on top of the Mac desktop. And this is exactly why MAUI with the Mac Catalyst target is perfect for those developers.
And it makes it much easier to debug the app. Just like if you're building the MAUI app on Windows, the best thing to do is run it in Windows, because then you can test all your code really, really quickly. You're not worrying about emulators. You're not worrying about putting it on a device. You just run it on Windows. Even if the app is only ever designed to be run on iPhones and iPads, you still build it and run it in Windows, because that's the fastest way to debug. If you're running on a Mac, you use Catalyst for the same thing, right?
Yep, that's the inner dev loop. And it's one of the things I'm always excelling at lately, and one of the improvements since Xamarin Forms.
Yep.
That inner dev loop is so much faster than it used to be. And that is one of the tips that, and what you just said, right? I'll deploy to WinUI, like if I'm on a Windows operating system, I'll just do the Windows deployment just to make sure that my REST API calls are working, that the lists are being populated, that the chart is showing. And then once all of that is working, I got done in a third of the time. I would have had to wait for emulators to start up and deploy to the emulator or connect to my phone. Like, there's a lot of time you save in doing that. Absolutely. Great tip. Okay. So where do we go from here, right? This is your debug build. And if I zoom out a little bit, we can see it more like an overall view. Don't worry, you're not supposed to be able to read the text. Just the shape of it, right? So we have section 1, section 2, section 3, right? So those are the 4 sections of the workflow. And I kind of find that stepping back gives you this clarity of the complexity that is inside each workflow. It's like, oh, it's just 4 parts. And then if we actually look at what happens as the end result, let's go see one of the latest builds. You see I've had some failures, and this is why this is so great in your debug inner loop, and you're done for the day and you check in your code and you go home. In the morning you see there's a failure, you caught a bug long before it got into anything else. Now here's the cool part of doing it this way, is that all 4 jobs happen at the same time, and look at the amount of time it took for each one. So the longest one is the maximum amount of time you had to wait. The Mac OS one was done in 7 minutes, iOS 4 minutes, Windows 6 minutes, and Android 12. Now, if we combine these all together, that's how much time you would have had to wait if they were done consecutively in your traditional pipeline workflow. By having them as separate jobs, it works perfect for you.
Nice. Guess you're going to have to cut the coffee break shorter, unfortunately.
I'm going to pull up a, of course I have to sign in while we're live. I drew up a diagram yesterday for this, and I thought it might be a good way to show you that overview without having to zoom in and out of text. I'll drag that over here momentarily.
So those build times look pretty long. Is that because every time you do it, you have to set up the machine,
Some of
install
that
the
is involved.
workloads?
Let's take a look at the Android one. We can see how long each part took. If I zoom in, that might help a bit. So these are each one of the steps that we defined.
Okay.
Remember, the first part, setup job, is basically picking the runner, the operating system, and setting up everything it needs in that runner. Checkout is the very first step that we defined in our workflow was let's get the code. That took 8 seconds. Installing the .NET Core SDK only took 5 seconds. Setting up Java took 8. Creating the version number is milliseconds. Installing the MAUI workloads, it can be long sometimes, but it's gotten better, especially when you're using a GitHub runner because the CDN caches seem to be closer to the runners than they are to my local machine. I like the 2 minutes and 6 seconds, pretty quick because you're installing, I think about 16 different workloads, 16 or 17 different workloads you're installing altogether. Restoring NuGet packages took 4. The actual build itself took 5 minutes. Now keep in mind this is the debug build. It's very quick. The release build will take a lot more time. I don't have an example of a release build for you today, but it depends on the framework. Like Windows as an example, in the older UWP WinUI 2 it would take 10 minutes or so. That's because it's doing a .NET native compilation. It's actually compiling your .NET code into a native layer. This stuff doesn't require that, so it's a lot quicker than typical. And WinUI 3 is pretty quick. And all the final steps are usually just milliseconds too. If we look at the Windows one, you can see each step. Now, this is a benefit also to kind of debugging your workflows. Like say, what's taking so long? Just open this up, see what's going on. If you expand each step, you can see parts, the output of the step usually.
Okay.
I don't know why I didn't see the output there, but it's the console window. So everything in the console window will typically be coming out here. And your secrets will be masked. I was having trouble saying that one. But let's say you have a secret that you're pulling in from someplace and it will stay with just asterisk so that it won't be in the output. All right. So basically I just showed you how to do CI/CD or CI with MAUI. The CD part, the continuous deployment part, is what happens next. But to get there, we need to build our code in release mode. All of that stuff was a quick debug build. And this is where things can get complicated and why, if anyone's watching, they're watching this right now for this information I'm about to share. Everyone knows how to build debug builds, but now you want to build it with the certificate, code sign it, and do all that stuff. So towards the bottom of this, I have some really great resources for you. Gerald has a couple YouTube videos out there that really goes into great detail about how this works and how to set it up using both Visual Studio and GitHub Actions. But as a high level, I have this command. So if you come to this page, you just click commands and jump down to the commands section. This is where I give you the .NET Publish command. .NET Publish is the same as .NET Build, but you're packaging the app for distribution in some way. If it's a web app, it publishes it to a folder with the way the web app gets distributed, your DLL and maybe an index and your app configs and everything will be in there that you need to run the application. The same is true for .NET MAUI, with the exception that depending on the target framework, you might get a package. And that package is what you give to Apple. You upload it to the Apple App Store through a developer portal. But you need to sign that with your certificate, and you need to use your provisioning profile for that app. The .NET publish command gives you those parameters to be able to set. And the first one we'll look at is the Windows one. Windows is the easiest, in my opinion. It might not be for everyone. In my opinion, it's pretty straightforward because all I have to do is tell it, here's my code signing certificate. Here's my code signing certificate's password. Go ahead and sign the code, sign the end result, the assembly. And the flags to do that, well, before we go into the flags, notice this command. That looks pretty similar already because we've seen the configuration be debugged and we've seen the target framework. It's kind of why I kept it on one line, because I want you to have that visual recognition, like, oh, that looks the same as what I already know how to do. And it is. The only difference is this time you're telling it a little bit of extra instructions. You're telling it, okay, I want an app package. So for Windows, you get something called an MSIX. That's your package. That's where you actually publish up to the Microsoft Store, or if you're distributing it on the side, you would give your customer the MSIX file and they double click on it to install it. There are other installation routes. That's the simplest one. Another thing we need to do for this type of distribution is we need to be able to sign the package. And that's done with a certificate, a PFX file. Here, let me zoom in a little more. Is that better? Is that clearer?
Yeah, that's great.
And then there's docs on how to create that signing certificate for Windows and Android and iOS and all that. Those
Kind of, yeah. It depends on the platform. So what I do have open here is another project of mine. Well, you're basically asking, how do I get that certificate? Am I correct?
Yep.
Yeah. That depends on the framework. Microsoft doesn't host the documentation for all of them. It does host the documentation on what to do with them once you have it, and it might have links to go to get them. But for example, Apple, right? You would go to your Apple developer portal and you sign in with your Apple developer account, and you go to the page where you can generate provisioning profiles and certificate. Let me explain what a provisioning profile is, because this is usually the most confusing one. Usually you can sign your code with the certificate and it's done. But Apple wants you also to have a separate file that tells this package can only run in this one place. And those places are iPhone, Mac desktop, App Store, or ad hoc. Ad hoc is distributing outside of the store to a known set of people. You generate a separate provisioning profile file for each one of those. And let me show you what that actually looks like in real life. And this time, I find that this tends to help a little bit with mentally boxing up the result. So down here on the bottom, we have the provisioning profiles that you would use when you sign your iOS and your Mac Catalyst app. You can see I have different ones. I have one for ad hoc distribution. I have one for the App Store, iOS development. This is the one Visual Studio actually uses when you deploy to the simulator. You still need a provisioning profile. And here's one for the Mac Store. So the reason why I say all of that is because you need two things. You need your certificate, which for Apple is a P12 file. For Windows, it's a PFX file. Yeah, we'll jump. Let me go down to the iOS one, and then we'll go back up to Android. So to answer your question on like, what do you do with these files once you actually have them? There's a way to import them as a secret into your workflow. So the environment variables, we come back here, and let's take a quick look at a secret. So for example, My Telerik username and password that I need to use to restore with the NuGet server is a secret. We set those in your GitHub repository on the settings page. This is where you can place sensitive information that can be used in public facing things. And you reference it by using this special syntax. Now, what you can do is like, okay, I have this provisioning profile file. It's a file. I have this PFX file. How am I going to use this file in my public repository or even private repository? You don't want these files as part of your code. You should never check this in with your code. If they are online, they should be in Azure Key Vault or in some sort of protected area that can only be accessed on demand and with specific role-based access. Because if they're stolen, someone else can sign their malicious code with your certificate and distribute malware under your name. It's one of the reasons why you protect those.
Yeah, not great.
Okay, so yeah, you get a file. How are you going to use it? There are steps that you can basically export the file as a base 64 string, and you use that base 64 string as your secret. And then in the workflow, you change the base 64 string back into a file. So it's kind of, it's clever, but simple at the same time. And then once you do have the file again, you can import it to the runner. Because in order for Xcode to be able to compile and sign and package up the app, it needs to know both the provisioning profile and the certificate it needs to use. And they typically need to be ready on the runner for it, because you're basically saying, my code sign certificate has this signature, has this key in it. And it knows that because the certificate was installed. Again, here's the command, .NET publish, iOS release. Here are the extra flags that you would use for an iOS app. Where archive means package, right? So we're going to package it. This package, I want to work for ARM64. So that's your iPhone. It's also now, there's Mac OS, ARM64 processors, so there are more identifiers that you can use. The thing you usually look for is this first part. It'll say AMD or X64 or ARM64. Code sign key. This is this thing up here, what you just imported from your secrets. Oops. Provision. This is your provisioning profile that I just shown you in File Explorer. Now here's some cool things. These aren't always required, but I wanted to put them here because what if you're on a Windows runner or sorry, that's wrong. You can't really compile it there. You can be on a Windows runner with a remote connection to a Mac. That's essentially how Visual Studio works with being connected to a Mac. You can do the same exact thing in the CLI. So if you happen to be using one Mac or one Windows machine and you need to do this compiling and signing on another Mac, you can actually just give it the IP address of the Mac, the username and the password of that Mac user, and the port.
Is that your personal Mac?
It could be your personal Mac.
I thought this was all happening in the cloud if you do it through GitHub Actions.
Yeah, so in the cloud you wouldn't need this because you would be on a Mac OS runner.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, let's go back to that. And another thing too is just because you raise another great point. These runners do not have to be what's called a hosted runner. A hosted runner is a computer that Microsoft owns. It's in some huge server bank, and these are spun up left and right. Most of the time they're containers, sometimes they're actual hardware. But this one here, Windows-2022, is a Microsoft hosted runner. You can have a custom runner. And the reason for having a custom runner is because your certificates and profiles are already installed on this Mac. So it can be my personal Mac. And in fact, that's how I build a lot of my Azure DevOps, MAUI and Xamarin code, is GitHub or Azure DevOps will send the code down to your Mac and build it there. All the stuff will run there. That is one example why you would want to use the IP address. But these are not required. Okay. They're just a cool extra benefit if you need them. This is the .NET SDK directory. Sometimes it's needed, sometimes it's not. I don't have hard evidence what happens when you don't use it. So maybe it's not needed anymore. Someone might be able to tell me that. But I do it just anyways. And there is a default .NET directory on Mac OS that you could use too.
Okay.
Mac Catalyst is pretty close, but not identical. You have an extra thing, a Mac sign-in key, and you usually give it entitlements in the publishing command. So you would point it to the ERP list for entitlements for the Mac Catalyst app. These instructions are all here. Oh, I lost it already. Oh, here it is. Yeah. This is why it's always good to come back to these docs because of the nitty-gritty of the individual parts of each command. I highly recommend. This is why I made this. Bookmark my gist, and you can jump to any one of those you need, or bookmark those that you can find more details about them. The main point is that the main point I want everyone to walk away today is we've got about 5 minutes left. Is that you recognize this. So .NET Build, .NET Publish, .NET Restore, everything these days is built into the .NET SDK. Long gone are the times where we needed a bunch of extra special MS Build flags, or you needed to use a particular MS Build and it only worked in certain places, or you had to use mono in a special way on the Mac. It's really straightforward now. Zoom out a little bit and let me show you my chart.
So before we talk about the chart, we did have a question in chat and another
one.
We
got a couple questions from Jose.
Let's get to those.
Jose's first question was, do we need to compile ahead of time or AOT when targeting iOS or Android?
That actually happens at the same time. So you can speed it up. So if you do .NET Build first, in the .NET Publish, you can use a flag called skip build. I think it's skip build. Let's use the .NET Publish documentation to be 100% right. No build. So if you pass the .NET Publish command, this flag, it won't build it again. But you don't have to use .NET Build command before this, and it will build it for you.
Okay.
Great.
Jose's other question, what about App Center? What role does that play? Is it still used?
Ooh,
which I'm actually familiar with App Center.
Actually, I'm not sure what App Center is up to these days. It was a great help for my Xamarin apps. I can follow up with everyone on Twitter after or share it here. I can reach out to the App Center
team. Can you
team.
still use it as a way of sending an app to your beta users? So kind of side loading, if you will, or ad hoc loading on somebody else's device, add them to the list of beta users. And then you used to be able to send them the app via App Center. Is that still usable?
If MAUI works there, then I imagine that infrastructure part still works because it piggybacks off of Apple's ad hoc distributions list because they still need to be listed with Apple in order for them to be able to install the package.
Yes.
App Center just made it way easier to be able to send it to them.
Okay.
Any other questions? What else we got?
I think that's it for now.
That's it at the moment.
Okay.
Thanks, Jose. Keep them coming.
And I mean, I'm literally always available.
Actually, I have a question.
Yeah.
I have a question. So all the Xamarin apps and the MAUI apps that I'm building, I'm just using myself. I'm not going to put any of them in the store. They're all for my personal use. And maybe I want them on my wife's phone or someone else's phone. do I do the DevOps differently, or do I just do it the same way, whether I'm just putting the app on my phone versus putting it in the store? Do I have two different
Yeah.
workflows, or do I just have one workflow?
What you would use is your ad hoc distribution profile. This
Okay.
is just for iOS. For Android, it's much easier. All the user has to do is just enable developer mode on their phone, and they
Right.
can install your package.
Yeah.
Windows can work anywhere.
Okay. So
Yeah,
I
but that's
focus on
what
the
these are
ad
for.
hoc distribution. And do I need to be part of the Apple developer program to
Yeah,
do that?
yeah. So
Okay.
to
Okay.
get
I
these
didn't know that
certificates, you do
required.
need to be.
Okay.
But Apple no longer makes you pay for it for an individual account. You only need to pay for it when
Oh,
you want to distribute to the store or ad hoc. You can do it locally on your own.
oh, that's good news. I'll
Yeah.
have to double check that they're not charging me.
It was a pretty big wall if you're developing an app and you don't know if you're going to publish it. And about 3 or 4 years ago, they announced that the developer program was allowing individual accounts. So if I open Visual Studio, this is a great time to show this part too. So if you go into Visual Studio Tools, Xamarin, Apple accounts, you put in your ID. And your Apple developer account has two components. It has the individual component and the professional distribution component.
Mm-hmm.
So if I click View Details, we can see your profiles and your certificates and all these different things from your Apple account. And this is all inside Visual Studio. You do not need a Mac at all to do this unless you want to build release packages for distribution, right? So you could deploy from Visual Studio using the VS Wildcard development profile that Visual Studio creates for you
Mm-hmm.
and deploy it on your phone through Hot Reload or Hot Restart. I'm sorry. You do need an account, but it doesn't have to be a paid account.
Okay. Cool.
Great.
Outside of that, there is a chart in Azure DevOps stuff. We don't need to go into details on this, but Azure DevOps is identical to GitHub. Just the flavor of the commands is a little different, the syntax, but the steps are identical. Install dotnet, install the workload, restore your NuGet packages, build the project.
Okay.
Install the workloads, install your app stuff, build the NuGet packages, build the project. Same thing, 4 different jobs, all at the same time.
Awesome. Glad there's consistency.
Yeah. I mean, that's what it really comes down to is it's a single project that has multiple target frameworks, multiple TFMs, and improvements in Visual Studio and in the way MS Build works with Visual Studio and the .NET SDK allows this to work.
Cool.
And knows this isn't very readable. It'll make more sense. So what I showed you now was one workflow, one MAUI.yaml file, and it runs 4 separate jobs. But what if you don't always want to do those other jobs and you only want to do iOS or you only want to do Windows? What you can do is, whoop, that's not how you move things around. So what we did earlier was code changes happen in your repo and it triggers this one GitHub Actions workflow. What if you had 4 different workflow files? You can do that. You can have one that only has one job. And if the code changes in the Windows project, then it only builds the Windows code. Or you can manually trigger each one when you're ready for it to be built instead of it automatically triggering every time you push to the branch. So there's tons of flexibility there. You can do them all. And here I just added the commands that are already in this. Zoom out a little bit. It's already at the bottom of this. One last thing, the Android one, very similar to other ones, except for Android, you use 4 different things. You use a key store, an alias for the key store, passwords for both. So You would know what these are, and again, they're in kind of like in the documentation and part of you setting up your Google account and your Google developer account. You get these things. Once you have them, you just pass them into your .NET publish command.
Mm-hmm. Cool.
Starting to see a pattern, right? It's just whatever one you want, and then you add the flags that it needs for that particular build. And I think that's about as much as I can talk about, like the overall idea. Drilling into the specifics is several videos on each on their own. This is pretty much the best place to start. Once now you've built your app, you come here, go through the docs, familiarize yourself with what you need for that platform, and you prepare your materials, your prerequisites, get your certificate, get your provisioning profile, and plug them into your CI/CD or locally build it once, get used to it, get the package, and then do it automatically every time.
Very cool.
Yeah, I like it. Sweet. So, yeah, thanks. That was a super thorough summary, and you already mentioned your guest or your gist, however people say that word, to go find more, which we'll try to copy paste in the show notes so it's easy for people to.
Okay, yeah. I did tweet this out, but I was wondering where you could post it for people seeing this video later.
We'll put it in the show description, so
Okay.
it'll be easily viewable.
Yeah. And then you said you're also available on X, Twitter, whatever.
Yes.
Twix.
Let me show you that. And go to my profile there and pull it out. So I tried to be clever and I tried to make an L out of an L and an underscore.
Oh, I see.
Right? But that's me on Twitter right there. And I usually answer quick. If you're not on Twitter or X and you're on Blue Sky, I'm also there.
Cool. Same handle.
Actually, because Blue Sky lets you set custom handles with your own DNS, is at Lance.Boston.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Cool.
I wish Twitter would let you do that. But
I wish Twitter would let me do a lot of things.
My GitHub might be also a good place for you just to explore and play around. I have tons of repos on there that do a wide range of different stuff. I've been playing a lot with a keyless secrets. So like, let's say you wanted to get a secret from Azure Key Vault, you want to sign your code and the certificates in Azure Key Vault, you can safely get it from your GitHub Actions, and it won't be anywhere. You don't have to remember it. Pretty cool stuff.
Awesome. All right, cool.
Well,
yeah, thank you so much for coming
Cool.
on the show and stuff. This was super cool to round out kind of a not quite mini series, but just a series of very similar videos when it comes to the subject leading up to deployment and DevOps. So this is great.
thank you for having me. I mean, honored.
Awesome. Yeah, so we hope to come. I mean, you already mentioned that some of the more detailed explanations could have their own videos, so don't be a stranger.
Yeah, that is actually a good idea. Maybe we can do it a real app. And funny that you mentioned that. And everyone watching this was not planned. I just had it ready in case it came up. So I did have an old app. It's not old, it's still current. But this is an app that I want support to .NET MAUI. It's only a Windows app right now. So I am in the process of porting the app to .NET MAUI. So I'm thinking maybe I should document the publication step in each phase I go through, and when it goes live in the store in each one of the stores again. So
that'd be great.
Absolutely. That'd be cool.
Awesome. Well, thanks once again. Thank you to everyone watching. Happy holidays. Happy New Year. Yeah, hopefully everyone's taking well-deserved rest and relaxation. I know I am. So yeah, until next time, or until 2024.
Yeah, we'll see you all next year.
Thank you.